Hello everyone, and welcome to Biopedia. Building on the theme from last week's episode, I'm going to discuss a second chess-themed evolutionary hypothesis, known as the Black Queen hypothesis. This evolutionary theory holds that genes may be removed from a population's gene pool by means of natural selection rather than genetic drift. So, to explain this theory, we're going to have to give a quick mention to genetic drift. Genetic drift involves a change in the allele frequencies of a population by chance, as opposed to a selection pressure forcing this change. These random changes can lead to the size of the genome of an organism also being decreased over time as genes are lost from the population. It happens frequently in bacteria which are or have become endosymbiotic, but is less frequently found in independent organisms. As an aside, I'm likely going to come back to genetic drift at some stage, so if I've missed anything or been incorrect, I'll redress the balance at a later date. Under the predictions of the Black Queen hypothesis, natural selection can sometimes be responsible for this loss of genes. If a gene becomes too costly, it's evolutionarily beneficial to get rid of it for the organism in question, thereby meaning that a selection pressure is created. For example, it has been suggested that organisms with smaller genomes can then have a higher rate of reproduction as a result, due to decreased time needed for replication to occur. As you know, evolutionary genetic success is measured by the number of offspring and descendants an organism has, meaning that this gene loss can therefore be beneficial to the organism in question. However, some genes are also of great benefit. So, how can an organism keep the benefits of the gene but lose the costs? Well, to put it bluntly, by cheating. This depends on how leaky a gene is. What this means is to what extent the impact of the gene's function can be felt by other organisms of the community. To give you an example, if the gene encodes for the creation of a compound, the leakiness will depend on how accessible that metabolite is to the wider community. If other individuals can access the functions of the gene, they can stop encoding the gene themselves, as it's evolutionarily beneficial for them simply to live off their neighbour's gene function. In this way, they get the benefits without incurring the costs. The end result of all this is that, although a gene is important to and retained in a community, individual organisms can shed genes to avoid the costs involved. This phenomenon can be relevant in combating virulence in pathogens, one example of which is the bacterium Pseudomonas aeruginosa. This bacterium produces a siderophore known as pyoverdin. As an aside, a siderophore is a molecule which is secreted to bind with and sequester iron, which is important for growth. Individual bacteria can produce the siderophore, but can equally just use the siderophore molecules their neighbours produce, without incurring the metabolic costs involved in producing it. These cheaters can be advantageous to medical treatments. If a virulence factor is collectively beneficial to a population in this way, a subpopulation which is susceptible to the antivirulence drug will turn to cheating to avoid being targeted by a drug. After all, if you're not producing the virulence factor, it makes sense that the antivirulence factor will not have an impact. These cheats, which are still theoretically susceptible to the drug as they've not built up resistance, will then create a selection pressure against resistant phenotypes. After all, the only thing that resistance will do from an organismal point of view is result in other organisms sponging off your metabolic end product, which is thus costly for resistant organisms. Accordingly, if Pseudomonas aeruginosa was treated with gallium, which removed secreted pyoverdin, it was found that growth was stopped over the course of 12 days, in line with the consequences of the cheating phenomenon. This only really applies in this context to so-called collectively beneficial virulence factors, which are beneficial to the population but are costly for individual organisms. However, what this example does show is that the phenomenon, as discussed by the Black Queen hypothesis, can be of medical relevance. As always, thank you for listening. I'm going to come back to virulence factors and the different types of them that exist at a later date, but I thought it would be useful to have an example to illustrate what we're talking about today. As usual, you can contact the show at biopediapodcast@gmail.com, for any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episode topics. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.